Years ago, I was talking to a fellow who was a missionary, and he told me that in his particular mission field, it took 20 years before the people that he was trying to connect with and reach actually looked at him and saw that he was real with his faith. It took that long. We can't imagine. I'm pretty sure that over in Malawi, if it took you 20 years, you'd probably be wondering what's going on here. And yet different people groups have different things that they use to be able to determine whether they are assessing somebody as being sincere in their faith. And so we're going to be talking about that sort of thing today, because the question becomes, how do you prove your faith? And, we think of proof as being something really complicated, like my picture of the math whiz putting a mathematical proof on a board, which to me, I'd say this all looks Greek to me, but it doesn't even look Greek. I don't even know what this is. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. But the point being is that every time that I encounter somebody who uses like incredible logic and reason to be able to talk about the faith, and they have all of these brilliant arguments, I think, well, that's pretty smart. And yet I can never remember what it is that they said. Well, they said something. Why does it seem so difficult? So we're going to be talking today about what makes it so much easier. So this is going to be a simple proof of faith that we're going to be talking about. And it's the simple proof of faith that you need to make a difference with the gospel. So, key question, what proves faith? And our key idea that goes along with it, which partly answers it, is faith is proved by how you live. It's not going to be proved by the logical arguments that you give. It's going to be proved because you live in such a way that people look at it and they go, oh, that person follows Jesus. That person is a believer. That person actually believes. Even when they encounter one of the mysteries of the faith that can't really be explained, they still believe. So how you live is going to make the difference. So our sermon passage today happens to be James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. That is on page 855 of the Pew Bible. And we start off in verse 13, which says, "If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom." So this idea of proof is it's going to be life and works, not going to be logical arguments. So now you have to look at how you're living and saying, okay, am I living in such a way that even without me saying anything, people go, that person's not necessarily like everybody else. That person, I wonder if they possibly could be a Christian. And sometimes people will actually wonder that. And when they find out about it, they'll go, yeah, I knew that. I was suspicious of this. So it's your life. It is the way you live your life. It's the things that you do. So these are the ways that you prove your faith. So arguments are out. You don't even have to get into an argument about it. And what I mean, I don't mean like arguing the way people argue. I'm talking about giving logical explanations for your faith. You don't have to get into that. When people see how you live, they kind of go, okay, I think I'm getting it right now. And when he talks about humility that comes from wisdom, he's talking about this idea that you actually are at the place where you accept what you don't know and what you can't do. You know that. Sometimes you find yourself doing things and you go, well, I don't know how I did that. Sometimes you find yourself accomplishing stuff and you go, I know I don't have any ability. I know I don't have any physical strength. And yet, how did that happen? And in humility, you realize that it's something that's coming to you from God. It's not coming from you. You don't take the credit for it. In humility, you don't take the credit. And it's not just a way of acting in an external way as, well, I'm going to just say this and then people will know how humble I am. Is that you actually really believe it. It's honest to you. It's honest to who you are and what you think and what you know is true. It's a real humility. And so this is what we're talking about when it's humility that comes from God. So, verse 14, But if you are bitterly jealous and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying. And I highlighted the word truth because I can't stress how important truth is to the Christian life. When I see people who are dealing with repetitive habits, whether it's an addiction or whether it's just behavior or whatever it is, when I am talking to people, usually what I find out is they have a way of not really being truthful about themselves. They have a way of somehow shifting the blame somewhere else. Well, it only happened this way because of what this person did to me or what circumstance I was in over there. It was all of that. It's like they don't take ownership. And what he's telling you here is don't get into the boasting and lying. Don't get into ways of trying to portray yourself as being somehow more wonderful than you really are. You have to own it. You have to own it to such a degree where you're going, I am not going to, in any way, shape, or form, lie about me and who I am. I'm not going to lie to me. I'm not going to lie to God. And I'm not going to lie to anybody else. You know, when I'm having a good day, then I'm having a good day. And when I'm having a bad day, then I'm having a bad day. It just is what it is, and I have to accept that. Because when I can accept the truth about me, then I can go before God sincerely and purely and talk to him about what my needs are. When I can do that, then I can have a better relationship with God. And so if you're a person who's suffering from jealousy and you are wishing ill on somebody else, well, that's something you got to wrestle with. That's something you got to own. That's something you got to go before and go, okay, God, I really don't have a good attitude. Selfishness is another thing which is really key. And it is amazing to me to listen to people talk and they're just dripping in selfishness, and yet they're trying to make it seem like it's somebody else's fault, that they are not experiencing whatever blessings that they think that they should experience, and it's because of somebody else. That's selfishness. That's putting yourself in front of somebody else. Until you are willing to do the opposite of that, which is to be sacrificial, to say, okay, I know what I'd like, but you know what? What I like really isn't important here. What is in the best interest of somebody else? That is what's important here. When a person can get to the point of saying that and to be honest about it, that's when truth starts to be able to change you. You will never be changed if you are not being brutally honest with you about you. It's just what has to happen. And, you know, you might say, well, but I only kind of mess around, you know, against the edges. It's not like I'm really making up like outrageous lies. And I would say to you, don't even mess around the edges. Don't even try to put, you know, a little bit of a sheen on something that doesn't deserve to shine. Don't be able to try to somehow, you know, put a facade on yourself of righteousness that doesn't belong to be there. You know, I'm not a furniture maker, but I can remember, you know, learning at a much younger age that, you know, the wood veneer that they put on cheap furniture, and actually sometimes pretty expensive furniture is made with a wood veneer because the veneer itself is so expensive. And the amount of craftsmanship that goes into doing it is really expensive. But not nearly as expensive as having a solid piece of wood made out of that particular material. That's what's going on here. And you don't want to live your life where you are covered in a veneer, a mere covering of righteousness, and everything underneath is still rotten. You know, that's not what we want. We don't want to be the whitewashed tombs. We want to be cleansed throughout. You don't get there without honesty. That is absolutely essential to what this is going to be for your life. Verses 15 and 16. For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. So this thing about the jealousy and the selfishness that goes on here, and the way he talks about it, unspiritual, demonic, and disorder and evil. These words that he's using in here in order to be able to make his point. And if you have ever lived in a case or a situation where a church is in the process of splitting, then you can actually see before your very eyes disorder. You see people who want something and they want it the way they want it, and if they're not going to get it the way they want it, they don't care how much destruction they do in the life of the church. They will do that destruction because they want what they want. They want it the way they want it, where they want it, how they want it, when they want it. It's totally selfish, and it ends up causing destruction. And that destruction lasts for a long period of time. You cannot have a strong witness to the world around you when what's going on inside the church is nothing but people who are pursuing selfish ambition. To have lived through that, to have seen it firsthand, is to look at the scripture and go, wow, James really understands what's going on. I wonder how much disorder he experienced in his day that informed him of this. Because I don't think that whatever we're experiencing in our world today is new to our generation. I think this has been the problem of man right from the beginning. Why? Because we're sinners. And so things never change. They might change on the surface because of the culture, because of the technology, whatever is going on, but the root cause of it is always going to be the same. And so he is describing this in this particular way so that you can look at yourself, and I've said this before and I have to keep saying it, which is this scripture isn't here so that you can point the finger and see what's wrong with somebody else. This scripture is here so that you can look in the mirror and see the truth about yourself, so that you can see what's true, and that you can talk to God about what's true, and you can say, God, I need help. So even if you have just a little bit of jealousy or a little bit of selfishness, doesn't matter. If it's there, you need to deal with it because it's unspiritual, it's demonic, and it's evil, and therefore it needs to be dealt with. So I want you to take it seriously, not so you can point the finger at somebody else, so that you can point your finger at yourself and you can deal with what God needs to change in your life. Verse 17. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It's also peace-loving, gentle at all times, and willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. So this is wisdom from above, because you're going to have the wisdom of the world, and the wisdom of the world is going to tell you to put yourself first. The wisdom of the world is going to tell you that you deserve a break today. That's what the wisdom of the world is going to do. And now, what James is talking about is God's wisdom. It's the wisdom that you get from God. And God is the one who comes first. You don't come first. God blesses you in many ways, but the blessings are never tied to you striving to get blessings. The blessings come because you give of yourself and you sacrifice of yourself and you choose not to come first. And when we get into the men's group on Tuesday, we're going to be talking about this in a little bit more detail. But the idea of being peace-loving, this idea of, and I'm going to say this, peace-loving, every time I encounter it in the Bible, it's not the world's idea. The world's idea of peace is that people just stop fighting and they get along, which is nice, makes life a whole lot easier. But in the Bible, it's always about being at peace with God, being restored back to God. So wisdom from above is you start off with like, well, nothing is going to change or happen in my life unless I am restored to God. So if you have unconfessed sin or anything that's separating you from God, anything that's causing you to not be what is being described in the passage, then you need to make it right with God. He says it's gentle at all times. And so often we see in the world around us, we see a total lack of gentleness. It's just people who are putting themselves first, and so they're allowing their anger to control them. And there's no gentleness in that. What about being willing to yield to others? You know, this is a huge idea. It's you can't make a church work, you can't make a marriage work, you can't make any relationship in this world work unless there is mutual yielding. It's each person willingly submitting to the other. If submission is going to be one-sided, and when I say one-sided, even if it's like one person is doing more yielding to another and the other person isn't yielding as much, you know, sometimes you run into people who, you know, they yield 1 times out of 100 and they go, yeah, but see, I yielded. Look at that one time. I was yielding, you know, I got this covered. Whereas the other person has to yield like 100 times out of 100. You know, we need to get it to the point where we're both practicing this, because every time we're not willing to yield is when we are being selfish. That is when we are assuming that we know more than somebody else. There's no humility in not yielding. It says it's full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. And you can see from the presentation from Gospel in Action today that the good deeds, what does it come out of when you listen to what was being said? You know, seeing the need, the need that children were starving. There was mercy there. Because of the mercy, there became a feeding program. The good deeds always follow out of the mercy, which is why they're together in the scripture. He says, no favoritism. It's always sincere. And so we had a passage that we preached from a few weeks ago that talked about favoritism. And the whole idea here is that if you are actually sincere in your faith, if you actually trust God the way you're supposed to, if you actually trust God and obey God, because they always go together. If you trust him, you believe him, and therefore you're going to obey him. If you're doing that, if your faith is sincere, then you're going to be seeing another person based on what's in their best interest, not what's based on your best interest. Favoritism is always built on selfishness, not sincere faith. So these two ideas go together as well, and that's why they're in here together. Verse 18, and those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. And I actually really like this verse quite a bit, because peacemakers. So who are these? These are the people who actually, it is their purpose in life to help people come to a place where they are restored back to God and they are now at peace with God. They are no longer an enemy of God. So that's what he's talking about. He's talking about peacemakers, people who their goal is to get people to the point where they are restored to God. That's what it means to be a peacemaker. And it says that they're going to plant seeds of peace. In other words, they're going to be talking the gospel. It's either going to be a real gospel presentation, or it's going to be the good works and letting people know that this is the love of God which is coming your way. There's going to be a seed. It's either going to be a very blunt seed or it's going to be a more subtle seed, but it's going to be a seed. So they're going to plant the seeds of peace. In other words, they're going to be planting the seeds of restoration. Okay? So that's the gospel and everything that comes with it. You know, it's the stuff that we really don't think of as being the gospel. And remember what I was telling you about the missionary that said that it took him 20 years. They needed to see the real faith. They needed to see the sincere faith. They needed to see that he meant it. And finally, when his children were grown up and they saw that he had raised his kids to believe as he believed, that's when people said, well, okay, I guess this is real. And they started listening, and they started responding, and they started having lots of baptisms. And it took them 20 years to be able to get to that point. It doesn't take everybody 20 years. That was that particular missionary in that particular culture group where he had to face that. But every culture group is different. And so we see from what they are doing with Gospel in Action, when they go out and they repair a borehole, and people now have real clean water so that they can live. And then they get to be able to present the gospel message to people. They are, on the one hand, planting seeds with the good works that they're doing, and then they are turning around and they are being peacemakers with the message that they give. And everything that they've told you about this morning has gone into this sort of an idea. I wanted to give this message today because when I found this scripture and started preparing it, I really had no thought that it would have anything to do with the presentation that was going to precede it. But as I was getting closer and closer to being finished, it's like, wait a minute, this message really does tie into the mission report that we were given today. It really shows us in a practical way that people live their life in such a way that others look at it and they go, their faith is real. Their faith is sincere. I can listen to what they say about God because I can see in everything else that they do that they are real about who they are, that they actually care, that they don't put themselves first. They see what others need, and they do what they can to help meet that need. That is what real missions work is. And it doesn't matter whether it's in Malawi or out on Main Street in Albion. That's what missions work is. And so we need to look at this and say to ourselves, how do we as a church collectively, how do we get to this place? And then he talks about reaping a harvest of righteousness. And I love this word, a harvest of righteousness. The righteousness are going to be all the people who accept Christ. Those people who have heard the gospel message and have accepted it, that is the harvest of righteousness. Because once they have accepted Christ, they now are righteous in the eyes of God. That's the harvest of righteousness that I think that he's talking about here. And so I really enjoy what he has to say about this. So where does this bring us to in terms of our truth nugget? That faith is proved by how life is lived, not by a good sales pitch. We tend to think in our country that if we just make the presentation slick enough, if we just make the arguments persuasive enough, if we just, hit on people's hot buttons, that they will accept the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what James has been telling us is that that's not the way it's done. The way it's done is how you live your life. You need to look at yourself and say, am I experiencing the jealousy? Am I experiencing the selfishness? Am I concerned about those things, about me and what I can get from me? Or am I willing to be sacrificial for what I care about, what I want for me, in order to do what's best for somebody else? Because as soon as we live our lives for the benefit of others instead of the benefit of ourselves, that's when we are in a position to be able to tell people who Jesus is and what he has done for them. And they are much more willing to listen to what we have to say. So the takeaway, this is the application for what you're going to do, is when I obey, I prove my faith. I've told you in weeks before that obedience comes from trusting God, believing God, and then obeying God. That is the way we have to live our life. You don't obey because it's a rule and you have to do it, and if not, you're going to get slapped around. That's not what obedience is all about. Obedience is just the natural outgrowth of trusting God and believing God. And you trust him, so you believe him. So when he tells you things, you go, well, I guess I'm just going to do that because God said it. I don't have to necessarily understand it, but I'll go with it. And that sort of a life is what actually proves your faith. And so I want you to consider that. I want you to think about doing that in order to prove your faith, and not whatever else somebody might dream up as being a proof of faith. It's going to be how you live your life and how obedient to God you are. That's going to prove how much you believe your faith.